Okay, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I'm really excited for this interview with Pastor Doug Wilson. He's graciously agreed to come on and to compare and contrast his view with a sort of politically liberal view, a view I've termed Christic liberalism before. Um, and so we're going to try to sketch both of those visions, see where there might be some overlap, and see where there is divergence. And I'm going to sort of articulate and get Pastor Doug's thoughts on some of my own objections to his own view here. But how are you doing, Pastor Doug?
Doing great.
Great. Awesome. Well, we'll jump right in. Now, if I understand your view correctly, you would phrase it in terms of theonomic libertarianism. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Um,
Theonomic
yeah,
libertarianism or theocratic libertarianism. Yeah.
great. And insofar as I understand that, that would hold that in an ideal Christian nation where most people are Christian, and we should then implement the law of God. That's sort of teleological or held out as an ideal, and we're making steps towards realizing that, which might not mean we implement the law of God right now in all of its fullness, but we're sort of progressing towards that as an ideal. How does that
Correct.
sound as a
Yeah.
summary of your view?
Sounds great.
Great. So here's what I'd ask. If I'm understanding that, then it would seem to follow that in that Christian nation, uh, the idolatry, public expressions of idolatry, so public expressions down the line in the future, most people are Christian, would be rendered illegal. So it would be rendered illegal for an atheist to publicly try to proselytize on behalf of atheism. Would that be right?
No.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Please feel free to
So
correct.
it's either a no or a yes, but. Okay. So in my book, Mere Christendom, I have a chapter on blasphemy laws, and that's what this boils down to. And I argue that blasphemy laws are inescapable. Every society has them. There are certain things you're just not allowed to say that are an affront to the gods of the system.
Hmm.
So I have offered before that I could go down to any major downtown in any major city in the United States and get arrested within 15 minutes on
Hmm.
the basis of what I was saying only.
Hmm.
Okay. So
Hmm.
because and why? Well, we don't call them blasphemy laws.
Hmm.
We call them hate speech and things like that. But in effect, they are blasphemy laws. We don't allow people to blaspheme the gods of the system, which in our secular democracy would be demos, the people,
Hmm.
right? So every society has blasphemy laws. So that's not really the question of whether this Christian republic that I'm envisioning would have them. Of course, they would have them. The only issue would be what kind of blasphemy laws, blaspheming who, and by whom.
Hmm.
Right? And in my book, Mere Christendom, I argue that in Scripture, throughout all Scripture, the biggest blasphemer is always the state. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, the harlot in Revelation has names of blasphemy written on her forehead. Nebuchadnezzar's statue is a blasphemous statue. Nero's uh, self-exaltation was a blasphemous
Hmm.
self-exaltation. And you see this all the way through Scripture. So um, everybody thinks that if we had Christian nationalism, or whatever you call it, if we had that, the first guy we're going to go after is the village atheist who runs off a mimeographed newsletter with a circulation of 17 people, and we're going to put him in the stocks and pelt him with vegetables.
Right.
that, that's what we're going to do. But my interest, and this is where the theocratic libertarianism comes in, I want to harness and subdue the biggest blasphemer first. But let's get the big one.
Hmm.
And in order to do that, you must have limited government,
Hmm.
right? Because the blaspheming is done by unlimited government, a government that thinks it's um, all that.
Mm,
And so, and there's a catch-22 involved in this, and that is if I could use the illustration of the uh, oh, what was that called? After 9/11, there was the Patriot Act. Oh,
mm,
okay. Um, when you pass the Patriot Act because we're going to catch terrorists,
mm,
um, and a bunch of Republicans voted for it, they voted for something that was uh, going to be shortly controlled, possibly by Hillary,
mm,
right?
mhm,
All right. Now, why on earth would you do something like that? If you give the state the power to punish blasphemy,
mhm.
right? You are giving the state power to blaspheme.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. And and this is the center of this particular argument. Christians should never forget that Jesus was executed on a blasphemy charge.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
And and so consequently, Christians, I think, ought to be very, very wary of blasphemy charges,
Mm, mm,
right? Um, because the center of our faith is look what they did to Jesus.
mm,
And it was done by theological experts. It was
mm.
done by the respected authorities in Israel at the time. And I think we need to be very, very wary of that. At the same time, having said all of that, I do believe that 500 years from now, we would have to figure out what to do with the village atheist
Mhm.
who um, who just wouldn't quit, just wouldn't shut up about it.
Right.
Um, uh, but there, I think it would be if we restrained the government and we only were able to do that because of widespread Christian consensus,
Mhm.
then the way you restrain the nickel dime blasphemers is by means of peer pressure and um, uh, social
Huh.
pressure,
Huh.
right?
So even in that Christianized state, it would be through social pressure and not necessarily through the
Right,
imposition of the law.
right. Or
Mm,
if the law was brought in, it would be brought in under the aegis of fighting words.
mm,
So we believe in the First Amendment, but you're not allowed to go up behind a fellow on the street and start talking about his mother
right.
6 inches away from his face,
Sure. Yep.
right? So, and we have a doctrine of no, free speech doesn't include fighting words.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Mm,
And let's say if you had an overwhelming Christian consensus in a Christian society, and some guy decided to strip naked and go down and start blaspheming,
mhm.
there would be ways of restraining that wouldn't be ecclesiastical Gestapo kicking his door in. Uh,
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Okay.
all right, so
Yeah.
the force that I am willing to enforce blasphemy laws, but I want that legal enforcement to be applied to the state,
Hmm.
and I want the nickel dime blasphemers to be handled by them not getting invited to parties.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. So that would seem, when would you agree with this? That would seem to be a difference with Stephen Wolfe's vision in the case for Christian nationalism, in which someone who publicly proselytizes would have the force of the law brought down on them. And that seems to also be a kind of different vision from uh, bringing back Reformation Europe. Would
Right.
that be
Yeah,
accurate?
that's fair. That'd be an area of difference, but a place where I would agree, for example, is if someone said, "So, in your in your ideal republic, would Jews or Muslims be allowed to congregate and worship?"
Yeah.
Uh, Okay, and I'll take the Muslims because that's the easiest example. I
Hmm.
would say, number one, you would solve a big part of this problem by not having open door immigration,
Hmm.
right? In other words, you don't paint yourself into that corner.
Hmm.
Why do we need 3,000 mosques in the United States? Well, it's because 50,000 Muslims came here.
Hmm.
Well, let's not do
Sure.
that. Let's not do that. Um, that's one thing. The second thing is assuming that they're already here. I have no problem with them gathering together and praying together and doing that sort of thing. but no minarets. Church bells, church a minaret is a Muslim prayer tower,
Right.
a
Right.
public call to prayer.
Yep.
The public spaces would belong to Christ,
Mm,
right? So no minarets. If they wanted to get together in private and pray, fine, fine, but no public claiming of the territory. Church bells are fine. Minarets would not be fine. Um, and and a Muslim who brought his four wives to Disneyland, he'd be fine too. Yeah.
sure.
He
Sure.
can bring his prayer rug.
Mm,
Um, but what you do is there are ways to protect the public spaces and the public confession of the republic of the country
sure.
without um, without being totalitarian.
Sure. So then suppose so under certain COVID restrictions, Christians, there were many Christians who chose to continue to meet
Mhm.
over and against what everyone thinks about that. Um, it seems like a Muslim could use that sort of similar principle in that sort of ideal state of saying, well, even though the government makes this illegal, we're going to do it anyway.
Right.
In that situation, would sanction come down on them?
Yeah, but obviously you can't have a restriction that is toothless.
Hmm.
Right? You know, you can't say you may not do this, and because all they have to do is say, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna."
Yeah, right, right,
And-
right.
Right. But I would say that there would be creative ways to deal with that without resorting to medieval tortures.
Sure, sure. So you wouldn't necessarily advocate for like the sanction of if they keep doing it, then execution
Oh no.
would. So given that, then, so it's part of Stephen
I'm I,
Wolfe's. Yep,
I'm thinking of things like revoking a visa.
sure. Yep, yep. Yeah.
Right.
So part of Stephen Wolfe's argument is that if we're going to consistently apply Old Testament wisdom to these situations. Idolatry, blasphemy is a grave evil. It's worse than adultery. It's worse than murder, physical murder. And so it would seem then that if the state is theonomic, uh, that then the gravity of the offense would correspond to or would merit the grave sort of sanction from the state.
That's
Uh,
exactly right. The offense is a really grave one, which is why Caiaphas tore his robes.
right, right. Yep,
Okay. And
yep,
I'm far more worried about Caiaphas,
sure,
right? That's the guy I want to thwart at every turn.
sure, sure,
And at the same time, I would agree with Wolf that you don't thwart Caiaphas with the pretense of neutrality.
sure,
That doesn't that doesn't thwart anybody.
sure,
So what we have to do is structure get a Christian consensus, structure our laws such that we fry the biggest fish,
sure,
right? And that will limit our ability to fry the little fish.
sure, sure,
Okay. Um, but that's all right because we can deal with most of that by social sanctions and consensus.
sure,
Right.
sure.
Right. And if somebody else slips through the cracks, fine with me.
So, okay, gotcha. So would it? So if we agree, and I would agree that it is that idolatry is a grave evil. I just have a sort of different conception of the state. And I'll get to that in a second. But um, I think we'd actually both be in agreement of weariness about the government and actually about a limited government to a
Right.
large extent. But to my mind, it seems that for the unrepentant Muslim who's sort of building mosques, if one takes the principle that the government is for implementing the law of God, then one has to say they're committing an offense that's at least as bad as murder under the auspices of the law. Wouldn't that follow under your view?
Uh, no,
Mm.
Um, because, so for example, in the Old Testament, it was at least as bad as murder for an Israelite to go off and worship an idol.
Hmm.
Okay.
Right.
But that's a case of apostasy.
Mm.
Um, uh, was it um, was it at least as bad as murder for a Moabite still worshiping um, Chemosh?
Mm.
Okay, to visit Israel. Was it all right for a Moabite to be an ambassador to Israel?
Sure, but it might be as bad for a Moabite to try to entice Israel to worship
Sure.
Chemosh or to entice them to worship Baal. So
Yeah.
if a Muslim proselytizes, then and they're trying to entice Christians to worship Allah,
Right.
would that be, in your view, a grounds for um, eventually
We would
execution?
have to figure out a way to keep that from happening, to stop it. Yes.
Okay, okay.
Right.
So I'm curious then the alternative vision and what some of your critiques might be of this, of Christic liberalism, would be something like this. Like even so, we'll just grant that like most of the world is Christian. Even so, the government under that view would be for the sustaining of a common life. I think you'd agree with that. It's for the ordering of a common life. Per Aristotle, through upholding a constitution, the constitution being the organizing form of the government. Uh, a kind of Christic version of liberalism would say, in agreement, actually, probably with the Reformation, that faith can't be coerced. You'd agree with that, I'm sure.
I
Um,
would, yeah.
so even though someone can come to Christ through forced baptism, that's not ideal. It's not
Right.
an ideal way to come to Christ. Uh, so the government then should not coerce and should allow for the kind of robust freedom needed to submit to Christ and shouldn't therefore coerce faith. Um, and because sanctioning alternative expressions of faith, whether it's atheistic, whether it's Islamic, would be a form of coercion. It would be a sort of restriction on that kind of freedom that's needed to submit to Christ. With that freedom, one can choose not to, and they can choose to live contrary to Christ with the very same freedom with which they can submit to Christ. Um, the government then would seek, even a Christian government would seek to limit coercion to preserve to those offenses that violate the upholding of freedom. But the non-coercive power of the state under Christic liberalism would be a place where the Christian magistrate could try to make advances on society that increase the community's participation in the life of God. So if a civic magistrate has the choice between either sponsoring a pride parade or has the choice between building a civic center for the arts, the Christian magistrate then should build the civic center for the arts in order to give the community a sense of the transcendence and beauty of God, which serves as a kind of preparatio for the gospel. How would your vision sort of agree or disagree with that? And the Christic liberalism would say that's the way the government, it's not just a pragmatic thing for now, that's just the way the government should act until Christ returns.
Okay. So, in terms of how that government acts, um, I agree with a lot of what you said. My one question would be, when we're running this Christic liberalism, do we call it Christic?
Yes. Yeah, I would say
Right.
so. Assuming most of society is Christian, then
Yeah.
yes.
Well, so if it's self-consciously Christian,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Self-consciously Christian, the Supreme Court, as our Supreme Court said in 1892,
Yeah.
would say that we are a Christian nation,
Sure. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
That's good. Yeah. Yeah.
okay, we are in fact a Christian nation. That has implications. So and we have to act on those implications.
Hmm.
And there's plenty of room for debate as we're working through this. But for example, um, the first thing that would come up would be immigration.
Sure.
All right.
Yep.
Under Christic liberalism, would we throw the doors open to hundreds of thousands of Muslim immigrants?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say even under classical liberalism, one could say that because the government's primarily obligated to its citizens, um, immigration limitations and the way one balances this is going to depend on the government securing the integrity of its own common life, of the common life of its
Right.
citizens. So to the
So
extent that immigration undermines that common life, there should be restrictions. To the extent that it doesn't, then the magistrate has freedom to permit.
you can eliminate 90% of your problem with mosque building by not allowing in 90% of your prospective mosque builders.
Sure. And
Okay.
yeah, so I think a Christic liberal state, so part of the vision there would be the recognition that at any time, even if one is post-mill, that at any time, any individual nation is tenuous. At one time, Europe was, of course, broadly Christian. Now it's not, even though Christianity worldwide has grown. Uh, so it would seem that one could still hold that because any individual nation is tenuous, the government's being self-consciously Christian is one that's by consent and one that could that their national apostasy is always possible, and so it would
Correct.
allow for the possibility of apostasy. But I think then the magistrate would seek to allow at least a good number of Muslims, and especially from countries we can't send missionaries to, in part in order to have Christians have them interact and engage with Christians,
Yeah.
with the hope that they would eventually come to Christ.
I'd be all about student visas. Yeah.
Sure,
Yeah, because that's evangelism.
sure,
But um, this goes back to C.S. Lewis refers to Aristotle's old question about behavior that democracies like and behavior that will preserve democracy,
sure,
which those are not the same thing.
sure,
There, there are behaviors that Christic liberalism would like
sure.
that might not preserve Christic liberalism,
Hmm. Yeah,
uh,
such as
such as Muslim office holders.
sure. Yep,
Okay.
yep,
In other words, if the state is formally Christian,
sure,
uh, then you have at some level a religious test for office,
sure.
right? And um, and somebody's going to say, well, the Constitution expressly forbids that. Well, it forbids it at the federal level,
Sure.
but when the Constitution was adopted, there were all kinds of religious tests
Right,
for
right.
office,
Yep,
right?
yep,
In fact, in Maryland, you couldn't become a notary public if you didn't believe in God
yeah,
down to the
yep,
1960s.
right. Yep, yep.
Right. So, uh, what this whole secular experiment has revealed is that there's certain questions that are going to inconveniently intrude themselves,
Mm.
no matter how much we wish they wouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
and that's a good question. So Christic liberalism would hold that actually you could have, at least as I'm sort of articulating it and from the sources I'm pulling on, you could have in theory an atheist or Muslim office holder, but they would have to be elected, and so that would be, they would have to win the consent of the people. And so yeah,
And would they have to vow to uphold the Christian order?
yeah, good question. Not necessarily. And
What
that
would the oath, what would the oath of office be then?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it would be a commitment to the preservation of a common life that enables flourishing. But Christic liberalism would say that a Christian magistrate can self-consciously promote things that tend towards people's assimilation to God, whereas I don't think the one can oppose those things that don't. So one can
For
advocate
example,
against those things that don't.
our current oath of office
Yeah.
is to uphold and defend the Constitution
Yep.
from all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Right.
If that Constitution is
Hmm.
explicitly Christic,
Sure.
then a Muslim would have to vow, a Jew would have to vow to uphold that Christian order.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it would be Christic in the sense that there are Christian grounds for it, not in the sense that the Constitution itself guarantees or is committed to the lordship of Christ. So that's an important distinction. So
State that distinction again.
yeah,
The first
yeah.
part was what?
So it would hold that the Constitution, so the commitment to freedom itself is grounded and has as its presupposition the order of Christ and the mission of the church. Um, but it doesn't write that into the Constitution itself in the same way that the Constitution can assume, our modern Constitution can assume the equal dignity of all people. But that's sort of an underlying assumption that
Right.
depends on other things that ground it.
So, all right, I think we're making headway. What you're describing is the United States in 1915.
Sure, sure.
Okay.
In some
Okay.
ways. Yeah.
We had an informal establishment.
Yep.
Uh, the United States, when in 1892, when the Supreme Court determined that we were a Christian nation, I
Sure.
think that was true,
Yeah.
but we didn't have a formal established state church.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good, it's a very good comparison. That would be something like
Okay.
what I'm advocating for. Yes.
And then neither did we have an express statement that Jesus rose from the dead in
Right.
the Constitution, or the Apostles' Creed was not in the Constitution.
Yep.
But we felt we lived in a safe neighborhood. We didn't have to have those doors locked because it was a safe neighborhood,
Right. Yep.
right?
Yep.
But you acknowledged earlier the danger of apostasy.
Hmm.
So the apostasy that has happened in our society
Hmm.
over since the Second World War
Yeah.
in the secular post-war consensus,
Sure.
right? That Rusty Reno describes
Sure.
in Return of the Strong Gods. That whole thing, that same play, could be run on us again.
Sure. Sure.
Okay. Now, having pointed that out, I would say that the United Kingdom, the UK, is an explicitly Christian country
Sure.
with the
Yes.
with the
Yep.
monarch being the head of the church,
Yes.
and that didn't keep them from going secular.
Right.
They're just as secular as we are,
Right.
in some respects, even more so.
Right.
So there, I know that formal church attachments or um, formal expressions of the truth of Christianity in your documents
Yep.
is not going to necessarily prevent the apostasy that we both grant could happen.
Right.
Right? I just want to make it more difficult.
Sure.
And for people who want to be treacherous, for people who want to undo our freedoms, I want to plant as many landmines for them as I can.
Sure.
And it's not so much the things we say in our Constitution, but the firewalls we establish to limit the size of our government.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the overlap with someone who holds the Christic liberalism would be agreement that we should try to limit um, those opportunities for apostasy. The disagreement, I think, would be over the means. It seems to me, though. Correct me if this isn't your impression either. Um, that it such that the means for someone who advocates for Christic liberalism would be primarily social and primarily, and actually probably exclusively social, and exclusively unless there are violations to freedom, such that Christians need to get a lot better at evangelism and public holiness than we have been, and discipleship and things like this than we've been in the past, rather than the coercive power of the state.
Sure.
Yeah, how would you sort of assess that
So
in light of?
I agree with you completely that this is not going to happen until we get a lot better at evangelism and church planting, and you have an overwhelming Christian consensus.
Mhm.
But let's say, and I'm speaking as a postmillennialist.
Yeah,
Let's
sure.
say let's
And that
say
is cards on the table. That is another difference, cards on the table, but I don't want to touch that issue.
um, but let's say in my post-mill vision,
Mhm.
it's 75 years before the Lord returns.
Mhm.
The lion has laid down with the lamb. The kids are playing with the cobras.
Yeah.
Everything going great. Someone's gonna look around and say, okay, can we um, not allow Muslims to govern now?
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
haven't had a Muslim here in 200 years. Is this is
Yeah.
it okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it okay to name the name of Christ
Sure. Yeah.
formally when we have conquered informally?
Sure. Sure.
Now,
And
I agree with you. This is really important. I agree with you that it's crucial that we not get a bare squeaking majority or a talented minority
sure.
that gets political power and then tries to clamp down in a top-down way
Sure.
that forcing people to affirm things that they don't affirm and don't understand and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
But if there's a grassroots transformation, I don't see anything wrong with a nation saying we're Christian and that's what we are.
sure. Yeah, so that would be a difference. So the Christic liberal would then say, even 75 years out in that scenario, in theory, we could still have a Muslim leader.
Right.
And so that seems to be then a genuine difference. So then given that view, right, and to some extent, the reason I like your vision more than I like Wolf's vision. I think it's in some ways it's closer to Christic liberalism, but I do think, and tell me what, of course, push back on this. Um, I had a chance to actually sit down with Stephen at ETS, and I do think he's being consistent insofar as if you would agree then that in that state, 75 years from the return of Christ, we don't want a Muslim building, we don't want a Muslim running for office, we don't want them to build mosques. And if they keep doing that, then you can start to put sanctions on them. Um, it seems that one would want to then start doing that. That entails one doing that when they have a sort of a critical mass of Christians, even if that critical mass is a minority. And for this reason, I'm assuming both of us oppose abortion because we both think it's a grave evil and it
Mhm.
destroys a human life. It destroys something made in the image of God. But then I would also add, and because it very clearly violates freedom, namely the freedom of the fetus, right? It
Right.
destroys the freedom of the fetus. Um, it would seem that if a bill came on Congress tomorrow, on Congress's floor tomorrow, and it was actionable to outlaw abortion, I would say we should take it. We should do it. Would you agree with that? That if there were an
Would.
actionable tomorrow, we should sign it, into law, outlaw abortion because abortion's that evil.
Correct. Do it.
Okay, so why wouldn't that then apply to idolatry, which I would hold is I do think even it is an evil that's comparable, but the difference is that it doesn't violate the freedom of anyone for a Muslim to worship or whatever. Why wouldn't, in your view, then that sort of similar thinking apply to preventing the Muslim from building a mosque?
In order to make the circumstances parallel, this goes back to my point about blasphemy laws.
Hmm.
If Congress said we are going to outlaw abortion
Hmm.
throughout the United States,
Yep.
but we are going to reserve the right for the federal government to perform abortions.
Hmm.
And the power that we exercise to close all those uh, free market clinics
Hmm.
is power that we are reserving to ourselves.
Okay.
Okay. Uh, when the federal government says we are going to outlaw Islam,
Hmm.
I'm asking myself, what power does this give you?
Sure.
Okay. You're saying that uh, Islam is a blasphemous religion,
Hmm.
and as a Christian, I agree with that.
Hmm.
Okay, but what powers of definition for blasphemy are you reserving to yourself?
Sure.
And what reassures me that you're not going to pull a Caiaphas in 5 years,
Sure.
and it's going to be a whole lot more difficult for me to deal with your Caiaphas
Hmm.
than for us to deal with this mosque.
Sure. Sure.
In other words, I really am suspicious of state blasphemy,
Sure.
and state-sponsored blasphemy is far more of a big deal and far more of a threat than free enterprise blasphemy.
Sure. Sure.
And
But couldn't one make a similar argument from outlawing abortion? So if we give the government that sort of power to outlaw abortion, that's a kind of power over life and death, and which people count as people. Um, and we don't want to give them that power, and therefore we shouldn't advocate
but
for
I would say God gave them that power
to.
in
Mm,
to protect life.
sure.
That's one of the fundamental things they're charged with doing.
Sure.
the state is supposed to do that, and they're answerable to God for not doing that.
Sure.
Same Bible that tells me that they have the power of the sword to punish the wrongdoer
Hmm.
in Romans 13
Sure.
is the Bible that tells me to beware of their blasphemous conceits. And
Sure.
they all do it. Um, every empire in the Bible from Nimrod down is guilty of this thing.
Sure.
And and so uh, and this is a place where I'm not trying to be cute here, but when I describe myself as a theocratic libertarian, I regard classical liberalism
Hmm.
in its genesis to be a fruit of the Reformation.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yep.
Okay. I believe it. I believe it is a fruit that it grows on one kind of tree,
Yeah.
and that tree has been the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And the Christian faith was so widespread and pervasive that the Christian sources of it went without saying.
Yep. Yep. I
Okay.
agree with
Okay.
that. Yep.
But as I look back on it, I see all kinds of indebtedness to the Christian faith.
Right.
And classical liberalism could not have arisen in Muslim countries. It
Yes.
could not have arisen in these other places, and
Yep.
it could and of necessity would arise in a Christian society.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, all I want to do is have the government admit that in public.
Sure. Sure.
Right. So if you took me back to 1915,
Yeah.
I'd be really happy. I'd say,
Mhm.
man, this Christian nationalism is great. And
Sure.
you might be saying this Christic liberalism is great.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah, we'd both be right.
Yeah, okay. So that's but I think then the one difference would be the Christic liberal would say this should be how it is until Christ's return. And you might disagree with that. You would say the more people become Christian, um, eventually we should outlaw or prevent the Muslim from taking public office or things like that.
No, I always want it to be I always want enforcement to only be at the margins.
Okay.
Okay. So um, is something happening with the lighting here?
Yeah, something's happening with the flag outside.
Oh, okay. All right. Um, so every law is dependent upon 90% voluntary compliance.
Hmm.
You can't police everybody,
Hmm.
right? Um, if if let's say shoplifting a pack of M&Ms,
Sure.
right? If everybody did it, the cops are helpless,
Yeah.
as we see in San Francisco, where they
Yep.
finally give up and say, okay, shoplifting, we're not going to prosecute it. We
Right.
just give up.
Sure.
If you have an honest, honorable, conscientious populace that in 95% of the cases police themselves,
Sure.
then it's possible to police the margins.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. And you can police the margins without tyranny.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Now, I believe that the only thing I would say with regard to religious doctrines is that I'd want the margin at the edge that is policed to be significantly smaller than it ordinarily is,
Sure.
because of my wariness about Caiaphas.
Sure. Sure.
Right? But at some point, you might say, "Hey, man, no, knock that off,"
Sure.
and
Sure.
you police something that is doctrinal in nature. No,
Sure.
you can't be the county commissioner because you're a Socinian.
Sure. 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 Yeah. Okay. Okay. So but that would then come at the point at which there is Christian consensus.
Correct.
Now, I would agree that that can happen at the level of the people. So the people voting against the Socinian, because they don't want a heretic in office. But it seems like you're advocating that that could even happen at the level of the government itself.
Yeah,
Um,
but at the very this is at the very tail end of everything.
right. Right.
And my hope would be that it would not be necessary. So
Right.
I'm an old guy,
Mhm.
and I can remember um, uh, in the JFK election, the fact that he was Roman Catholic was a huge deal.
Yes. Yep.
that
Yep.
in that election.
Yeah.
He was the first Roman Catholic to be elected president, and it was a big stinking deal. Now, as it happened, he was elected. Also, when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, the
Yeah.
fact that he had been divorced was a big deal.
Yeah.
The
Yep.
fact that he was on a second marriage was a big deal.
Yes. Yep.
And I think that a lot of the uh, heavy lifting that we're talking about would be done in both of our systems by the electorate. If
Sure.
if you had a Christian electorate, well taught, well instructed, worshiping God regularly, there's certain people that just wouldn't get elected,
Yeah. Sure.
right?
Sure.
And I would not want to rush to the law first
Hmm.
to be our protection.
Yeah.
I much prefer the informal consensus of a Christian people.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so I would agree with that. It strikes, so then I guess the tension for me there, and the reason why it seems like someone like Wolf is being consistent in arguing, for instance, that even if there were a Christian minority, right, they could, in theory, a Christian minority could overthrow a secular majority in the case for Christian nationalism. Um, the reason why that's at least consistent is because if the underlying principle is we should punish the government's punishment of evil is pretty comprehensive. It's not just evils touching freedom, but it's fairly comprehensive. It seems like one would then have to say that, well, yeah, in 1915 America, that wasn't good enough. Because they still allowed for, the sort of public proclamation of atheism or things like this. Why
Right.
why wouldn't so yeah, why wouldn't that follow? Sorry about the light too. I think the flag started to blow in the wind, so that might just actually continue. But
Uh,
yeah, why wouldn't that follow on your? Why wouldn't
yeah,
that
the
follow
logic
on your
the,
view?
the logic follows,
Mm,
but I would like to say, why are we talking about how to deal with the three atheists?
sure,
There's
sure.
only three of them. There's only
Well,
three of them.
one could say that, well, because for the same reason that one might deal with three murderers, right, or three serial killers or whatever, because they're publicly proclaiming and doing evil to their neighbor of that caliber.
Right. So when the state says, I um, I believe that Romans 13 gives the state the monopoly on violence. Okay.
Sure.
So I'm at the end of Romans 12. I'm not supposed to take vengeance myself,
Yep.
but leave room for God's wrath. The civil magistrate is God's deacon of wrath.
Yep.
Yeah, so he's expressly given the power to punish that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And Paul is not talking about that was written under the rule of Nero.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So even Nero can punish murderers,
Mm,
and
yep.
Paul can praise Nero for punishing
Right.
murderers,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Uh, at the same time, I don't want to give Nero the authority to define blasphemy.
Sure. Sure.
Because the first thing he's going to do is what he did,
Right.
was
Sure.
build a 90-foot statue of himself.
Sure.
And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But if you had that sort of Christian minority sort of take over, the Christian minority are the ones legislating that.
yeah, I
Um,
don't, there are a bunch of Christian minorities that I don't trust either.
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. You and I are agreed on that.
Okay. So, um, you know, the Spanish Inquisition
Sure. Yep.
was a good example of people who were exercising a power I think they ought not to have had.
Yeah. Yep.
Right now,
Yep.
um, at the same time, I acknowledge that something has to be done about this blasphemer because blasphemy really is wicked.
Right.
We want to
Sure.
we want to get rid of it. We want to eradicate it. The issue is this something that law can get at?
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, and so in Romans 4:13, and this is again from my post-mill background,
Hmm.
not through law that Abraham was promised the world
Right. Sure.
through the righteousness of faith,
Right.
right? And so when Paul is talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols, so let's put it this way: if I were dropped down in the middle of the Rwandan genocide,
Hmm.
where people were running around mauling people,
Right.
killing people, I would have an immediate Good Samaritan obligation to hide people in my basement.
Yes. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
I can't just say, "Oh man, what a shame,"
Yeah.
and I'm a white guy, so I'm going to just watch.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
I don't get to do that.
Right.
But Paul can be plopped down in the middle of Corinth
Mm.
or Athens with idols everywhere,
Hmm.
and he doesn't react the way he would react if it was murder.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
What he does is he has the long game in view.
Sure.
He says, I want to overthrow all this.
Yep.
He does that by planting churches, teaching, preaching, and as it happened, it took 3 centuries.
Right. Yep.
And the difference between a reformer and a revolutionary is revolutionaries are impatient.
Yeah. Yep.
They want it, they want it now. And one of the things I'm concerned about, and I address this in my book, uh, Rules for Reformers,
Hmm.
is the revolutionary has to have it now.
Sure.
And it's possible, I think, for Calvinists to become revolutionary ideologues,
Sure. Yep.
right?
Yep.
They want it now.
Yeah.
And as soon as they get the political power, they overreach.
Yeah.
Then there's a recoil,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they're not thinking like generals.
Yeah.
They're,
Zwingli is a good example of that. Yeah.
or another example would be the Puritan Revolution in England,
Sure. Yep.
where, and in fact, I would say the two great moments where this happened, where Christians found themselves in control before they were ready for prime time,
Sure.
right? They
Hmm.
were the play was not ready for Broadway yet.
Yeah.
Uh, were on the after Constantine, it was good that Constantine legalized Christianity. It
Yes.
was
Yep.
good. It was good that Theodosius made it. Well, and it was good that Constantine outlawed the pagan sacrifices, and Theodosius made it the religion of the empire. Okay, but I start to have problems with Theodosius,
Mm.
not because of what he did, but because of all the pagan apparatus that's still lying around
Sure.
that is going to be a temptation to Christians who walk into how do we run this contraption?
Sure.
How do we run this thing? I think the Puritans did the same thing, where they were so meticulous, great preachers, had the whole thing worked out. Then when they had power under Cromwell, um, I think they overreached. I think they tried to do too much. They didn't play the long game the way Paul did,
Sure.
and so consequently, I think they set us up for Charles II.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Sure.
And that's the thing I'm leaning. So if I'm having a hypothetical academic debate
Sure.
with Stephen Wolfe about what it's going to look like 75 years before the Lord returns, I think there'd be a lot of commonality.
Sure.
If we're talking about how do we get from here to
Right.
there,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I want a lot more evangelism, a lot more consensus building, a lot more social pressure, way
Sure.
more than I think Stephen wants.
Sure. Sure. And there's an extent to which I can see that. Now, interestingly, so if I heard you right, it sounded like you sort of pointed to Constantine as an example of when he outlawed pagan sacrifices, as an example actually of that being a good
Yeah.
move for a magistrate. So that's where I think a Christic liberal would also dissent. So someone like me would look at Constantine, Theodosius and Justinian, and be very, very uncomfortable with that. Uh, but interestingly, it would seem that there wasn't a Christian because Christianity was still in the minority, even
Mhm.
though when Constantine did that. So it
The reason, but
sounds
the reason I'm for that
Hmm.
is because we're looking over. I'm just assuming that these were publicly funded sacrifices. Um,
Sure,
I don't think he was chasing the goat herder, um, who was the word pagan comes from paganus,
sure.
country dwellers.
Yep,
So Christianity was an urban movement,
sure.
and pagans were out in the countryside. And so if someone was still leaving offerings for the wood elves,
Yeah,
that's not addressed by what Constantine did. What we're talking about is the garlanded bull at the tax-funded city
gotcha.
celebration thing, and that was I'm altogether in favor of the cessation of those pagan
Sure,
sacrifices.
sure. And that, yeah, so that's interesting. Um, and yeah, I think to some extent there'd be overlap there, but okay. So you would say, insofar as Constantine did more than that, you would dissent if it's true that he did more
Yeah,
than that.
I would dissent, and what I would probably dissent with is the speed, not the
Yeah.
goal.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Right,
All right.
right.
So in Glenn Sunshine's book, Slaying Leviathan,
Hmm.
he has a good section on the early church father Lactantius,
Yep,
who
yep.
was an advocate of religious
Right.
toleration
Yep,
and was the tutor to Constantine's children.
yeah,
Right. Right.
yep.
And I believe in religious toleration also, but I want religious toleration in the name of Jesus.
Sure. Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yep,
I want
yep.
us to say the reason we're not going to deport you is because Jesus rose from the dead,
Yes. Yep,
right?
yep.
And if there's 50,000 of you, we are going to deport you
Yeah.
because Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. Sure. Yep. Yep. And yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And because of the implications of that. Yeah. Okay. So that's helpful. And so you would say that because the so it actually there sounds like there's some resonances with Thomism for Aquinas when he talks about not punishing vices that the people can't bear to have punished. So he's not for the government outlawing brothels or things like this, because he thinks the people couldn't bear that. It sounds like there's similarity there insofar as you're thinking, well, if we do it right now, if we sort of make other expressions illegal right now, people wouldn't actually be able to bear that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I believe that you have to play cards with the hand that you're dealt.
Sure,
And I believe that a Christian magistrate should do everything he can do to promote public decency and order.
sure.
And there will be some things that he can't do,
Mm,
right? Um, and now, and my model for this would be the way the Old Testament evaluates various kings.
sure,
So and so is a good king, but he did not remove the high places.
sure, sure.
Okay. Now
Yep,
there's an implied rebuke that he should have,
yeah,
right? If
yep,
he'd been a little more courageous or had a little more faith, he
yeah,
would have removed the high places. But there are also situations where you just can't, you just don't have the power.
sure,
Um, David tells Solomon to deal with Joab
sure,
uh, because David says, I don't have the ability to deal with Joab.
sure,
You succeed the throne, you will have the ability to deal with him. And as soon as you have the ability to deal with him, you should,
sure, sure.
right?
Yep,
Um, now I think a godly magistrate would, let's say, a problem with brothels or taverns or the people being dissolute.
yep.
Um, that is a huge public. It's not a matter of public decency.
Hmm.
It's a matter of public order.
Sure,
Uh, that kind of society is going to be shot through with corruption.
sure. Yes. Yep, yep.
It's going to be a poorly functioning society, which is the magistrate's
Yeah,
business.
yep, yep.
So the one of the things that I would do, let's say, my joke is if I were president, and what a glorious 3 days that would be. But let's say I was the mayor of a city like that or a small republic, and there's been a shakeup, and I find myself in control of this place,
Yeah.
and there are six brothels in the town. Okay. And I look at my resources, I look at the police, I look at the vote division in my legislative chamber. I count my troops
Yep.
as Jesus tells us to do in his parable, or he uses that as an illustration. Let's say I know that if I just close the brothels, there's going to be a riot, and it's going to be a riot I can't control.
Sure.
Okay,
Yep.
okay. That doesn't mean I shrug my shoulders and say, "Oh well."
Hmm.
What it means is I would say, "Okay, um, do we have the ability to make an appeal to the ministers of our city or the ministers in our republic to form an urban outreach to these people,
Hmm.
to
Yep.
these people? What can we do to expedite the um, the reformation of manners,
Yeah.
right?
Sure. Yep.
So I would say, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I would say if there are any landlords, private landlords, who want to build buildings that can be in these areas that can be used by the Salvation Army or
Hmm.
the equivalent of that kind of operation
Yeah.
for 15 years, uh, that property is tax free.
Yeah. 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 Oh, that's
Okay.
interesting. Yeah.
All right. So
Yep.
what you're doing, this is a problem. We have to tackle the problem.
Yeah.
Uh, it's a reformation of manners problem.
Yeah.
So, what can I do to reduce friction
Hmm.
for those entities that actually can do something about drug addiction or street walking or whatever it is?
Sure. Sure. Okay. So that's helpful. So then there are two other questions then that raises for me. I'm gonna try to bracket the AML postable one to see if we have time for that. But I wonder how much of that is at the. So then when we're thinking about now, would you say it's legitimate for a Christian magistrate, so a Christian in politics right now, to advocate for reducing the number of Muslims we allow in for fear of them building mosques or whatever?
But yeah, yeah, it's not for fear of them building mosques. It's a fear of them acting like Muslims.
Sure, sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
So basically, um, uh, I have no problem with a Christian legislator
Hmm.
or a Christian whoever the director of immigration.
Yeah,
I have no problem with him saying, first, let's turn off the tap of this unrestricted immigration.
sure, sure.
And then let's develop a set of criteria for, since our job is to act in what's the best interest of the United States,
Hmm.
who who are going to be a problem if they come,
Hmm.
and who will be a contributing uh, asset to
Hmm.
our economy, to our cultural life, etc. So right now we privilege third world countries,
Yep,
and if you're a German or a Brit, someone like that, you're at the end of the line.
sure, sure.
Okay. And if you are a nuclear physicist from the UK,
Yep,
as opposed to a drug runner for a cartel
sure.
in Mexico,
Yep.
I would say, okay, our priorities are way out of whack.
Hmm.
Um, we are not running a rescue mission here.
Hmm.
What we're doing is we want to have um, liberal immigration policies for people whose values align with ours
Hmm.
and who will be contributing members of our society and will not be disruptive in our.
Sure, sure.
And I think
Gotcha.
that
Hmm.
that would reduce the number of immigrants from the Middle East greatly.
Sure, sure. Gotcha. So for the argument there, if I'm understanding this right, would be because the Muslim way of life, acting like a Muslim, would undermine liberal values,
Mhm.
um, broadly Christically liberal values. Uh, On that basis, allowing a mass influx of Muslim immigrants
Even
undermines social
yeah,
order.
even on Christic liberalism
Hmm.
principles,
Hmm.
do you really want to bring in 100,000 people who hate Christic liberalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would agree with there needing to be some limitation, but I do think it would be equally legitimate for a magistrate to say, okay, we have this much sort of capacity to take on a certain number of Muslim immigrants. We want them to come so that they can hear the gospel. I agree that it can't be unrestricted because that would undermine social order. Um, but it would seem that a Christian magistrate could say, insofar as it doesn't, we can allow an amount of Muslim immigrants or non-Christian immigrants, people
Mhm.
who are even hostile to Christianity,
Right.
in.
And a good example would be 50 years ago.
Mhm.
We didn't have a policy saying you're a Muslim, no, you can't come.
Right.
But we had control of our borders,
Sure.
and we maintained control of our borders, and we didn't have these questions,
Sure. Sure.
right? Um, uh, we have created this problem for ourselves
Sure.
because once we've opened the floodgates, we have to answer the question, what do we do with all these Muslims?
Sure.
What do we do with them? Well, you should have turned the tap off 50 years ago.
Yeah.
This is this is not something that we should not even be having the debate. Um, it should be a moot point.
So that's in a globalized world where more people are sort of in contact with each other. Um, would it, because in the 1950s there just wasn't as much mobility, limitations on technology. Um,
Right.
I think the Christic liberal would want to say that there isn't, uh, because there's more mobility in the world. The the question of immigration from non-Christian countries is more of a function of there being increased mobility rather than border restrictions as such. If that
Mhm.
distinction makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah. So then the last question I'd want to ask is if Amil, we'll see, and I don't know what your time looks like, but if Amil is true, so if
Then
that,
if all mill is true, then we're all hosed.
okay, well, man, that's a problem from my view. Um, given all millennialism, so that the there's this kind of the world could go either way at all
Right.
times. The church might grow, but the world could go either way. Uh, would you say that given that view, uh, something like Christic liberalism, where you sort of always allow for the possibility of national apostasy, for non-Christians to be in office, things like this, that would be more intelligent. Like that would actually probably be the way to go if Amil is true.
Okay, I would say even if post mill or Amil, if we suddenly were living in a Christic liberal society,
Hmm.
it'd be way better than what we have now.
Sure, sure.
So
Yeah,
consequently, I'd be really, really happy,
sure, sure.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
sure.
Now, in an Amil view, there's a range of oscillation. So
Hmm.
if things just improve and decay and improve and decay, and it just goes on that way to the end, I would like to be on the improved side.
Sure,
And if amillennialism is true, then it's quite possible that Christic liberalism would be as good as it gets.
sure, sure.
Okay.
Yep.
And if Christic liberalism is as good as it gets, then that's what I want.
Interesting. Okay, gotcha. So then and what does your time look like?
I've got about 3 more minutes.
Okay, gotcha. So then let me try to summarize our views and then we'll just close like that, see if you agree with the summary here. So as I'm hearing you, the world is tending towards the kingdom progressing.
Mhm.
But this doesn't mean the immediate implementation of God's law, but rather the gradual implementation there, and you have genuine concerns about not blasphemy laws as such, but blasphemy laws put into the hands of Caesar,
Yeah.
because Caesar, if you give that power to Caesar, Caesar's prone to abusing that power.
Yeah.
However, if we're 75 years out from the return of Christ, so way in the future from now, then you could get to a place where you'd prevent Muslims, non-Christians from being in public office. But that's sort of the goal, and the way you get there is largely through persuasion, evangelism, things like that. On the difference between that and Christic liberalism is that Christic liberalism says that the government is always for the preservation of both a common life, and the coercive power of the state is for the preservation of freedom, though the magistrate can act explicitly Christianly in non-coercive capacities to move society forward in participating in the life of God. And for you, you would say that view's better than what we have now because magistrates can still be Christian,
Mhm.
they can be public about why they're doing things,
Right.
um, even if it's not, it doesn't, even if it doesn't allow for even long-term non-Christians to be in office. Would that be a fair summary of the difference?
Summarized it very nicely.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Doug. Like I really appreciate you doing this. And yeah, I appreciate your charitability and your willingness to dialogue and engage.
Happy to do it. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Well, is there anything you would like to pitch to my audience while you're here? And anything you'd like to promote, any closing words you have?
Now, if you want to know more about what we're into on my blog, which is dougwills.com, on the front page, when you open it up, there's a portal to pretty much everything I'm involved with. So that,
Wonderful.
that's a good place to find out.
All right. Well, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you can go ahead and like and subscribe and share, that would help us out. Thank you so much. God bless.